Back in 2016, voters approved the sale of recreational cannabis across the state. While proponents saw a significant new source of jobs and local tax revenue, critics worried that the potential costs would outweigh the benefits. What do those in the industry now say? What do top researchers now think? We'll find out in today's edition of the Maddy Report.
Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. In November 2016, California voters went to the polls and legalized the recreational use of marijuana with a resounding 57% supporting the measure. Since that time, however, most local communities have been slow to allow cannabis shops to open up. What's going on? Let's begin with some background with our guest, Butsic, who is with the Cannabis Research Center at UC Berkeley. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thanks for having me.
So medical marijuana has been around for a while. What are the rules on recreational marijuana, and how do they differ from the rules on medical marijuana?
Yeah, so medical marijuana was basically started in 1996, and it had a 20-year run where essentially it was legal to grow cannabis for medical purposes and consume cannabis for medical purposes with a note from your physician. And that system was essentially highly unregulated. There was no tracking of who was growing cannabis. There was no tracking of who was consuming it. There was not really much tracking about who was selling it. And so while it was operating as a sort of legal market, there was very little regulation involved. That's all changed with Prop 64. So with Prop 64, we have a highly regulated cannabis industry now, where basically from seed to sale, every part of the product is tracked, traced, and frankly taxed as well. So we've gone from medical cannabis, which was legal but highly unregulated, to our current situation where cannabis is also legal but highly regulated.
Yeah, it's the same but different, I guess.
Exactly.
So in terms of state and local taxes, I know there are a lot of state and local taxes around the issue of recreational marijuana. Can you kind of spell them out for us?
Sure. So the 3 main state taxes is you have a 15% excise tax on cannabis, and that's paid by the distributor typically. You have a tax on the production of cannabis as well, and that's taxed at a little bit less than $150 a pound, approximately $150 a pound. And then you have the regular sales tax that you would pay on anything else, and this is in California 8.75%. In total, these taxes have they're bringing in a little bit over $1 billion a year to state agencies. Local taxes.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say local municipalities can also add their own taxes, and so local counties and cities can also add a tax to this as they see fit, both on the production side and on the sales side, and that varies highly throughout the state.
Yeah, it seems like some of the retailers are concerned or about the level of taxes because upwards of 40%, that it's so high that it's driving people into the black market because it's less expensive.
This is absolutely the case. So one of the main issues that we're facing in the cannabis market today is the persistence of the black market or the unpermitted market. So in California, most cannabis sold today is not sold on the legal market, it's sold on the black market. And most cannabis is produced for the black market. And certainly the price differential between the regulated market and the unregulated market is probably one of the factors that's driving that.
Yeah, I had seen statistics around 80% of marijuana use is in the black market, but they do expect that to shift toward the legal market over time. And at least with the legal market, you know what you're getting. In the black market, you don't really know what you're getting. I was wondering about, what are some of the key issues around, the manufacture, distribution, and sale of recreational cannabis?
I would say there's a few key features for the consumer that I think are important. So if you buy legal cannabis in California, it will have been traced basically from where it's grown to where you're consuming it. And throughout that process, there's a huge number of quality control points. So you can be pretty assured that if you're buying cannabis from a legal dispensary, you're going to get a high quality product that is exactly what it says it is on the label. It's been tested for pesticides, heavy metals, herbicides, all these other things that you don't want in your cannabis, and you're going to get a really good product. If you're working in the black market, there's no assurances there. That being said, you will oftentimes pay a premium for sort of that luxury.
Yeah, it's a brave new world, I guess, huh? Well, I want to thank Van Butsic with the UC Berkeley Center for Cannabis Research. Up next, what about the manufacture, distribution, and sale of recreational marijuana? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. So what about the environmental impacts of cannabis generally and on the state's agribusiness in particular? Our next guest is Phoebe Parker-Shames with the UC Berkeley Center for Cannabis Research. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Hi, Mark. Thanks so much for having me.
We're very glad to have you. So listen, let me ask you, what impact has cannabis had or likely to have on California's agribusiness production?
Well, at the state level in California, other existing agriculture is so large compared to cannabis production that it's hard to see it as a direct threat to those industries in this current moment. In California, across the state, there are 27 million acres of cropland compared to just 2,000 for cannabis.
That sounds small. In fact, I think I was looking at one of your reports and I did the math on that. It's if my math is correct, 0.007%. So teeny weeny, very, very small.
Yes,
I mean, it could grow,
small.
no pun intended.
It could grow. Yeah, and of course, there also could be sort of regional variations within a county or differences in local zoning regulations. So, if a county is restricting cannabis only to agricultural zone parcels, then you could potentially see some competition or price increases for ag land.
Yeah, and certainly up north, Mendocino County, things like that. It's probably a much bigger issue. But let me ask you this: what about cannabis and its impact on water? Does it use more water than other agricultural crops?
So the short answer is no. On average, it uses a similar amount of water per acre. But I will also say that there's a huge variation depending on if it's indoors, greenhouse, outdoors, and particularly sort of the specific irrigation setup that a farmer has on site.
Yeah, it's very, very different. Though it can be actually, I guess, indoors, it could actually be really efficient depending on how they're set up. Probably could be more efficient in their use of water. But what about, let me ask another question about pesticides and herbicides. Do cannabis farmers use more or less pesticides and herbicides than traditional farmers?
Yeah, well, I guess there's sort of a theme here with my answers because it, again, depends on the type of cannabis farming. So legal cannabis in California is far more heavily regulated for pesticide and herbicide use than other crops in the state. And the list of approved treatments is pretty similar to organic. Unlicensed cannabis is a little harder to study, but a survey that we did with the Cannabis Research Center in 2018 found similar pest control practices between licensed and unlicensed farms.
Yeah, but I would think like one of the things you hear, it's a layman's interpretation, but you hear that illegal pot grows use a lot of chemicals that damage water streams in the environment. I mean, if it's regulated, it would seem at least that situation is more under control.
Right. So certainly that's a really big difference. And when a lot of people hear about cannabis and pesticides, I do think they often think of those trespass grows on public lands. And certainly those are known for use of toxicants or poisons that can directly kill animals or bioaccumulate, do a lot of damage. But those practices are not known to be used in cultivation on private farms, even ones that are also unlicensed.
Yeah, you're an expert on the environment. So let me ask you a more general question about does legal cannabis, does it impact the environment? Well, what would be your assessment? Does it impact it in a negative way, a positive way, or really just like any other agricultural product?
Well, just like any other agricultural product, the short and simple answer is yes, it has an impact on the environment. Of course, the reality is much more nuanced than that. for my research on environmental impact, I'm really interested about specific land use practices that are occurring on the site and how those would influence surrounding wildlife. But really, when we're talking environmental impacts across all different types of cannabis, that can range from energy use, greenhouse gas emissions, direct or indirect impact on fish and wildlife, or sort of more general land use change and habitat modification.
Let me ask you. You know, one of your issues of area of expertise is on wildlife. Just quickly, or what impact has it had on wildlife?
Yeah, so depending on the type of farm and the sort of the scale, we see pretty similar effects as you would find for other types of rural development or rural small scale agriculture, with sort of general avoidance of wildlife around the area. The good news is that particularly for outdoor and small scale farms, there are a lot of things that farmers can do to reduce those impacts. So looking into integrated pest management, minimizing fencing to actually allow wildlife to move through those properties, leaving patches of vegetation on site, that sort of thing.
So there are lots of things, and this is a new and emerging world that we're entering. So I'm sure we're going to see more of this in the future. I want to thank you very much for joining us and giving us that background information on the environmental impacts of recreational cannabis. Up next, we're going to find out about the issues that retailers of recreational cannabis are having. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. What about the manufacture and distribution of recreational cannabis? We have someone from the industry joining us. He's with the California Cannabis Companies. He's their Chief Operating Officer, Jay Kelly, to answer some of our questions. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Hi, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So, early on, lab testing was finding about 20% of marijuana products were failing state tests for potency and purity. So what are you doing to ensure the safety of your product?
Well, Mark, early on when the legalization legislation first passed, there were certain mandated requirements for potency, purity, et cetera, testing of cannabis. There weren't enough labs, quite simply, to do all of the required testing that needed to happen. And that's where a lot of these inconsistencies happened early on. These days, we have sufficient third-party independent laboratories that test all of our, the entire supply chain, raw materials, all the way through to finished goods are all tested for potency and purity. So when you buy a product off the shelves, either from us at California Cannabis Company or any licensed retailer, that potency and purity testing has happened with a third-party independent lab.
Well, there are some concerns regarding recreational cannabis when it comes to edibles. Cannabis-infused cookies and candies, things of that nature. There's a concern that some inexperienced users may ingest too much. What are you doing to address that problem?
So again, in the latest legalization legislation, the state mandated limits are 100 milligrams per package and 10 milligrams of cannabis per serving within that package. That's the maximum that can be in an edible product. And so the really high limit products that existed early on, and particularly way back in the pre-legalization black market days, those products no longer exist. And again, with the full supply chain testing, if you go to a licensed legal cannabis retailer to purchase your products, you're going to be guaranteed that product has been tested for potency, and that potency is going to be no more than 100 milligrams in that edible package and 10 milligrams per serving within that package. Okay,
so this kind of all falls around the issue, frankly, of children, right? There's a concern that children might confuse, cannabis edibles with regular candy and cookies. What's been done to make sure that these things are child resistant when it comes to packaging, things of that nature?
Understood, Mark. And great question. And I share that concern as the father of 2 young children. In the cannabis industry specifically, we use the same child-resistant packaging that's used across multiple industries, whether that be the pharmaceutical industry, the over-the-counter medication industry, the supplement industry. We're using the same child-resistant packaging. So as a father, I view it as less of a cannabis industry specific issue and more of a parenting issue. When I have medication in my home, whether it's over the counter or prescription, I keep it safe and away from where my kids can access it. The same goes for medical or recreational cannabis, whether it's flower, edibles, or another manufactured product. I keep it where my kids can't access it. And we're required as an industry every product, whether it's an edible, a tincture, cannabis flower, a vape cartridge, whatever that product may be, Mark, it has to be in child-resistant packaging. And again, this is child-resistant packaging that's tried and true over decades of use in other industries. We're using those same packaging within the cannabis space.
Let me ask you another question. It's similar to what the issue with cigarettes, for example. The focus on how are these products being marketed? Are they being marketed to children? And so, what are you doing to make sure that these products aren't being marketed to children?
Again, a great question. As a father, this is extremely important to me and what we do at California Cannabis Company and industry-wide. The reality is, if you're purchasing products from a legal, regulated cannabis retailer, such as California Cannabis Company, we're not allowed to market those products to children. We're not allowed to use animated marketing. We're not allowed to use certain types of lettering. Again, this is all mandated by the state. And if you're buying products from a legal retailer, such as us, none of that activity can happen. Most of that, Mark, is a holdover from the pre-legalization days in the black market, and then the currently existing black market as well. We support all efforts to get rid of all cannabis marketing to children. Again, that's all occurring in the black market. It doesn't necessarily apply to the regulated market. Okay,
well, I want to thank Jay Kelly with the California Cannabis Company for joining us. Up next, what are the issues that retailers of recreational cannabis are facing? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. While recreational cannabis is legal in California, those retailers who want to open up shop have found it tough sledding. What are their concerns, and what is their response to the concerns expressed by communities that want to take a pass on recreational cannabis shops? We'll ask our guest. Tim Dodd is the CEO and co-founder of Sweet Flower, one of California's leading cannabis retailers. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Hey, Mark. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So let me start with this. How do you respond to those who oppose you locating your business in their community? You know, this not in my backyard syndrome.
Yeah, I think there's a number of ways to address that. A lot of it comes from education and engagement early on. I think there are a lot of misconceptions about what a legal cannabis dispensary is versus a unlicensed cannabis dispensary. And unfortunately, in some parts of California, that's really the only type of cannabis business that people are familiar with are the unlicensed and illegal operators. So a legal cannabis business provides a lot of community benefits, obviously provides high-paying jobs, well above minimum wage. It provides community benefits in terms of charitable givebacks and donations. Loitering, public consumption aren't issues for legal businesses. Underage use is not an issue as well. You know, there's very high protocols about security, about neighborhood improvement, about lighting, visibility, cameras, and other things around the area that really protect the neighborhood. And I think people, addressing the NIMBY issue, by and large, I believe that's kind of a stigmatized view of cannabis, not so much the operators themselves. So as long as we have big...
I'm sorry. Yeah. Let me take it from a little different perspective, and that's the issue of social equity. Who gets to benefit from recreational cannabis sales? I mean, there's some concern along those lines. What is your response to that?
I believe that cannabis is a local industry. I've always believed that this is while I'm not obviously from California, I've lived here now almost 25 years. And I believe that California and cannabis kind of synonymous with localism. I believe that this is a local business and that operators should be giving back. They need to be proactively engaging the community and giving back meaningfully, not just in terms of money, but also jobs, training programs, community benefits, parks and recreation, funds to police and other things as well. So social equity, I think, has got a lot of different flavors to it. We also need to remember that there has been a war on drugs, and that did disproportionately impact a number of communities that we serve. And so giving back in terms of jobs and in terms of opportunities for all entrepreneurs is really important, and that's got to be a big part of this.
Yeah, one of the things I was seeing was that they're expecting a big growth in jobs in this industry, and that the pay in this industry is substantially higher than typical median wage paid in a lot of jobs. So they're high-paying jobs.
Correct. Yeah.
Let me ask you this. There's also this issue of local control. So you have a situation where person buys cannabis in a locale that has approved recreational sales, but then it's delivered to a community that has specifically said, no, we don't want recreational cannabis sales. What do you say to those who say that violates local control?
Well, there's obviously, lawsuits going back and forth on that. So I won't comment specifically on those topics. But I believe that this is an area for local control. I believe that each government should be able to set its parameters about what it wants in its city. I think delivery from outside a jurisdiction to within its jurisdiction is obviously an issue that is being currently litigated. But the idea of localism, I think, is that communities should set boundaries, meaningful boundaries, and well thought through processes like we're seeing in Fresno, to determine who becomes an operator and who does not. And then also, I think they need to understand that this really does help. I believe this is an engine for economic empowerment, first and foremost. So it really does serve the communities well if they get together and build a thoughtful, well thought out cannabis licensing program. That's one way to frankly blunt, what they may see as encroachment from other cities, deliveries coming into a city like Fresno.
Yeah. It's just interesting that at least I was looking at, 57% of the folks supported the proposition that allowed for recreational marijuana, but only about 25% of local jurisdictions have actually permitted it. So there's a bit of a disconnect between those two things. Let me ask you, we only have about half a minute left here, but I want to get this in.
Sure.
Some are leery about allowing recreational cannabis in their communities because they're concerned about increased crime or increased auto accidents or impact on teen use. What do you and other recreational cannabis companies have to say about setting up shop in communities?
All the data supports, and all the data that we see supports legal cannabis dispensaries actually reduce crime. They reduce teen use, teen vaping goes down. There is no negative impact that we've seen. The only one that does show up as an indicator, and that's because it's being measured now for the first time in states like Colorado, California, is impaired driving through drugs, through cannabis. I apologize. So cannabis impairment has increased a very small percentage of that, tiny. But impaired use aside, there are really no negative impacts that we've seen, and the most important impact is a decrease in teen vaping. That's very significant. We don't sell, can't sell, won't sell to teenagers.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Tim Dodd, Sweet Flower. I want to thank our other guests as well. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.org. If you want to stay up to date on state and local politics, you can sign up for our free e-newsletter, the Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org.